Hello everyone, welcome back to APUSH. Today we're going to be looking again at historical period number 7 with key concept 7.3.2. Now remember, for this historical period we are not watching the videos in order of the key concept numbers, but instead with the numbers that are on your calendar in class and that are in the labels for the videos as they're posted on YouTube. So this should be the third video you're watching. Today it's going to be the course and foreign policy effects of World War I, mostly just the course of World War I. I'm saving the foreign policy effects for a separate video, so kind of two short ones out of this key concept rather than one very long one. Just works better for chronology. Alright, here we go. So, we're looking at kind of sort of the follow-up to what we talked about before regarding American imperialism. So this new policy that got us a little bit more involved around the world in terms of our relations with other countries. Now, for a really long time, remember, we had stayed out of world affairs because of George Washington's farewell address, because of isolationism, because of the Monroe Doctrine. But as we get involved more economically around the world, that's going to sort of seep into political things as well. So let's just talk about World War I in general. This should have been something you studied last year as a sophomore, but a bit brief review here. So let's talk about the causes of World War I. Mostly we're dealing with isms here. One major ism is imperialism, so that's competing for control of foreign lands. Basically, European nations were doing this before the United States was even doing it. And even amongst those countries there was competition, with Britain and France really having the most imperial control around the world, Britain really number one there, with Germany and other countries getting to that point later on, and that led to jealousies regarding kind of the size of control and what they had around the world. Now, going along with this is the idea of nationalism. Now, nationalism is kind of like patriotism taken to an extreme. It's not just pride in your country, but it's the self-righteous belief that your country is superior to all other countries, without considering that, hey, other countries think the same thing about themselves. You're so sort of wholly dedicated to worshiping your nation that you lose sight of why you like your own nation in the first place. The thing is, this was happening in all European countries at the time. There's also some nationalist movements within Europe where regions that were controlled by imperial powers increasingly want to be their own nation as well. It's in the 1800s where there starts to develop the idea of the nation state, things with like the unification of Germany and Italy. We see that smaller nations believe that they should have self-determination as well. So this is a problem that's kind of competing with imperialism on the small scale, but on the large scale and large imperial powers, it's just building pride within one's own nation. Militarism was also causing World War I to happen because these nationalist empires they were building up their militaries and their sort of arsenal of weapons. So basically, it kept on looking like there was this huge build-up to a war where there were minor wars, but never a large war between the powers themselves. It was always kind of proxy wars over who controlled things. And with each increasing proxy war, we saw that each of these imperial nations grew the size of their military. So basically, this huge military kind of conflagration is coming, and this is where it erupts in World War I. And the last one is not an ism, but it's just the idea of all these imperial, nationalist, militarist nations were creating systems of alliances and treaties with each other that made them tightly bound. So basically, eventually we get two major sides, the Triple Entente and the Triple Alliance, but before this happened, there'd been about 50 years of the creation of these intermingled treaties that basically said that if one party or one party of the treaty was attacked, the others were bound to defend them. But then if those defenders stepped in, that was going to cause other treaties to be triggered and other parties to enter as well. So basically, that's what kind of happens. I'm not going to go over World War I too much because that's European history. We need to talk about what's going on with the United States. Now, what's going on with the United States is we're on the other side of the world, right? We're in our kind of own separate hemisphere. We're controlling kind of Latin America, our own sort of imperial sphere of influence. And what we see happening is we're like, you know what? We have traditionally stayed out of these things. That's still what we're going to do. But what did we want to do? We wanted to continue to trade with all those powers that are at war. So when countries are at war, they're really focused on creating things for the war effort, but they still need all these other resources to continue as a country. We wanted to benefit economically by staying out of the war and trade with all the parties and really increase our economy as time went on. Here's what happens, and this is very similar to what was happening with the Napoleonic Wars back in the early 1800s, is those countries at war didn't like that we were trying to play the field and be neutral. They wanted us to basically choose a side. We were trading more with Britain and France. That was the side we favored, but we pretended we were neutral in order to benefit ourselves. Eventually, Germany saw that we really were favoring Britain and France, their enemies, much more, and they began a policy of unrestricted submarine warfare, meaning that any ship that was not allied to Germany, they were going to sink it, including neutral ships. So American trading vessels were sunk, and we're going to see that the sinking of one major ship is basically what gets us involved. So why do we finally get involved in 1917? The sinking of a British liner that was just kind of a passenger ship called the Lusitania. The Germans sunk it. There were Americans on it. So there's this feeling that Americans had died in the war effort. Should we get involved? The other thing that happened around the same time was Germany sending a telegram to Mexico saying that if Mexico joined the fray, joined World War I on their side, if their side won, they would try to get it in a peace treaty that Mexico would get back the Mexican cession that they had lost in the Mexican-American War. Now, during this time period, the United States was not really on good terms with Mexico. We were trying to impose our Latin American policy, dollar diplomacy, as well as imperialism on them as well, and they were not having any of it. So Mexico already kind of had a little bit of a bias against us. Germany was trying to play on that. So we viewed Germany's attempt to get Mexico involved as sort of an act of aggression against us, coupled with Americans dying. We joined the war on the side of Britain and France. All right, so we are now at war, but realize that we do not join the war until 1917. What that means is the war's been going on for 3 years. And what that means is all these other countries are deep in it, and we're kind of bright and fresh and having not been affected by it before. Ultimately, in terms of Americans, 4 million American men fight in the war. 10% of those soldiers were black soldiers, but they were still in segregated units. So we're still in the era of Jim Crow. Segregation was everywhere, including the military. A little bit above that says Congress institutes a draft. So some people were enlisting, but most people were serving because there was a draft. Okay, so remember, the war had been going on for 3 years, seeing very little progress between the European powers. Now what happened is pretty much all those European powers involved thought the war would be over by Christmas. Okay, they start around August, September. Every side was so nationalist, so militarist, and so self-righteous in their perception of their country being the best that they had no idea that this was going to last years with really no progress. Something that prevented progress in the war for either side had to do with trench warfare. So what that meant is there wasn't a lot of major battles and movement. It was that the soldiers on each side would dig these trenches and kind of shoot and try to blow up the other side's trenches without precisely knowing where they were. It was kind of like a game of Battleship. And what that meant is it went very slowly. So if they wanted to advance forward, they'd advance forward a little bit, dig new trenches, and keep on going. You have the case of maybe moving a few miles in months of battle. Okay? Something that really demonstrates the trench warfare well was the Battle of the Somme in 1916. It's a 5-month battle with over 1 million casualties and only a couple miles progress of moving the line to the other side. So you need to realize with World War I that it was very grating on the European powers. The idea that they were being worn down in these trenches that were had very poor sanitation. So there was a lot of sickness and stuff unrelated to actually fighting in battle. Now, when we arrive in 1917, by the way, the American troops here are called the American Expeditionary Forces. We help with numbers in battle to boost the British and the French side, but we also boost morale. So the Americans show up, and we had no really negative consequences from this war before. In fact, our economy was booming because of it. So Americans come over smiling and ready to fight for the cause of democracy, and the European soldiers are, worn down in the trenches, they see us, and it's sort of this psychological boost as well as a sort of strategic boost. Now, what you have to understand is the war ends in 1918. We're only involved for around a year and a half. So what does this look like? For us, U.S. deaths from the battle, from the war, I should say, only about 50,000. Numbers for other major parties: France 1.1 million, Britain about 750,000, Germany 1.8 million, Austria 1 million. So when you look at the effect on us compared to other countries involved, you can see that World War I, yes, we're involved, but that's why I'm not really talking about any war stuff, because we weren't involved that long, and we didn't receive kind of the sort of brute force of what trench warfare had been like for these other countries involved. On November 11th, 1918, the 11th minute, 11th hour, 11th day of the 11th month, an armistice is called between all parties. It's more or less Germany tried one more push in order to try and win. It didn't really work, and they were willing to sort of move forward to a treaty-making process, which would happen about 6 months later. Now, because the U.S. had gotten involved in this war, though, we get to be at the treaty-making table, and that's really important because we weren't involved for that long, but we're going to have a major guiding hand in the way that this treaty moves forward. All right, our last slide here about that treaty-making process. So, before we even get to the treaty-making process, our president at the time, Woodrow Wilson, had been creating kind of these ideals for what he would want to get in a treaty. He knew that we were involved. He knew that we were kind of a growing empire in terms of our policy around the world, and we had kind of broken the Monroe Doctrine. We had broken George Washington's mandate in his farewell address, so he wanted to make sure that our interests were reflected in a treaty because we were now involved. He called these his 14 points. I don't need to tell you what all 14 were, but the broad strokes are weapons reductions for all countries involved. He was saying militarism helped cause this war. We have to get rid of this weapon stockpiling so we don't have problems later on. Open diplomacy. So another cause of World War I were all those systems of alliances which were made sort of behind closed doors. So we wanted more open diplomatic sort of context around the world. Freedom of the seas, freedom of trade, so trying to open up connections between countries, and sovereignty for small countries who wanted it. Now, by the way, when he said that, he meant small European countries, because Wilson was a big-time racist. He was not looking to give sovereignty to colonies, just to countries that were in Europe and had nationalist movements from before. So, he had a bunch of points there, but his most important one that he cared most about was the creation of an international peacekeeping organization that would become the League of Nations. Now, ultimately, Wilson had all 14 points. He really wanted all of those in a treaty, but he said, you know what, if I can just get that League of Nations, we can work to make all those other things happen later on. So that was kind of like, you know, his card in his hand, that it's the only really strong one he had. The other ones he was willing to sacrifice to get the League of Nations. Now, eventually what happens is the treaty is made, of course, in Paris, because where else are treaties made? Here specifically in the former palace of Louis XIV and the French monarchs at Versailles. It's just outside of Paris. Now, Europe shows up to the treaty table wanting to punish Germany. And notice, if you know how World War I begins, it begins with a conflict between Serbia and Austria-Hungary. Germany then joins the fray to support Austria, but Europe says, no, 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 yeah, we know it started with Austria-Hungary, but we want to punish Germany. They're the ones to blame. We're going to blame the Kaiser. There was kind of this scapegoat thing going on. They wanted to say Germany has to pay reparations for all the winning parties to pay off all their war costs. Germany was still have to pay off their own war costs, and also accept complete blame for the war, when we know from slide number 1 that we had here that there was blame to share. Everyone was doing the same things. It just happened to be that Britain and France won the war. Well, what happens in this treaty? Basically, Europe gets what it wants, and Germany is punished severely. Wilson only gets one thing that he really wanted, the League of Nations. Now, these reparations for Germany were so high that Germany only paid them off in 2010. Okay, notice almost 100 years after the war ended. That's how long it took for them to pay everything off. And this treaty is so divisive, especially for Germans because of the economic fallout, that the problems here would lead to World War II. Okay, with sort of the rise of Hitler, the re-rise of nationalism again, and the sort of rise of the Nazi Party. Now, back to American history for a second. Wilson had a key role in making this treaty. Okay, and that's pretty much what he's remembered for anymore. But here's the thing you might not know. So, the Constitution says that the president makes the treaties, but he brings them back, and the Senate is the one that has to approve the treaty to put it into place. So, Wilson brings it back, so proud of what he's made, and the Senate says, nope, we reject it. They did not want to approve the treaty that Wilson had worked so hard to create, and ironically, specifically because of the very thing that Wilson only actually cared about, the League of Nations, which was Article 10 of the treaty. This is what Congress said, and it's actually a legitimate concern. Now, according to the Constitution, Congress has the sole power to declare war. And in the League of Nations with Article 10, it called for mutual defense in case of war. So that meant that if one country declared war on a member of the League of Nations, the other member nations were obligated to provide assistance. And Congress said that means that the president is, with this treaty, deciding when war could be made instead of Congress. So look to modern days, Congress doesn't really care anymore. But back then it was a big deal. They said, you know what? We're not going to approve it. We're going to reject it. And the U.S. had to make separate treaties with every single European power involved. So it's a lengthy process. Realized the Senate also rejected the treaty because the Senate was controlled by Republicans. Wilson was a Democrat, so there was just kind of like some partisanism going on as well. But you can see it's a worthy claim to say that, you know what, our Constitution says we get to do this. This treaty would violate the Constitution. All right, so this treaty is going to set up kind of our emerging role on the world stage, but it's also going to see in the 1920s that despite this emerging world role, we're going to sort of retreat back into isolationism. And that's what the second part of this key concept video is going to be about, but you're not going to watch this one until much, much later on. All right, number 8. Thank you so much for watching. Okay, you've got some terms to create on note cards, right? Red or yellow terms, and make sure that those terms come from this historical period, that you're not like writing down the Monroe Doctrine just because the term was used as a kind of synthesis to other eras. You've got, let's see, a quiz due 8 a.m. You need to work on your geography, chronology, next video if you really want to, and that's it. So this is Mr. Chodola signing off. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in class. Bye.